All right, guys, welcome back to the 9th key knowledge dot point of this third outcome, the penultimate key knowledge dot point for this one. And we are looking at CSR, corporate social responsibility in operations. So the concept of CSR, corporate social responsibility, is not new to you. We've talked about it a few times this year in a few different contexts. And if you did year 11, we talked about it throughout the whole of that as well. So not a new concept, but now we're just going to relate that specifically into operations. So here's our study design, and here is where this one fits. You can see right down the bottom, nearly there. So first off, I know it's not a new concept, but let's start with what is CSR to make sure that we absolutely get this right whenever we're asked. It's the most commonly asked for definition. There's more chance we've been asked for this definition than any other because it is the kind of one theme that runs throughout the entire course, year 11 as well. So CSR, the concept that businesses basically need to take responsibility for any social or environmental impacts of what they're doing. Okay, the idea is to encourage ethical practices in businesses so that businesses have a positive impact on society, hopefully, but if not positive, at least minimize any negative impact that they have. So in order to be viewed as being socially responsible, businesses are expected to adopt practices and procedures that exceed statutory minimum requirements. And that is really important, that point, as we'll see in a minute, and as I think most of you already know, because it's kind of part of our definition. So in a 2019 exam, they were asked to define corporate social responsibility. Here is the examiner's report, the example of a high scoring response. Okay, so I'm not going to read that out. You can read that for yourself. But you can see there's two aspects to that. Okay, going above and beyond legal obligations, and then in relation to this social, economic and environmental considerations. I wouldn't even necessarily, don't think you even need the economic, but certainly social, environmental you need, okay? And then the welfare of society, contribution to local economy or impact of operations and environment. So there's two distinct parts. So if you kind of break that down even more, okay, so the comments that are associated, the response in the examiner's report said that this was a 2-mark definition question. If I remember rightly, we hadn't seen many 2-mark definition questions before this point. So to achieve both marks, but I would even say, even if it's this for 1 mark, you would still need both aspects of what we're about to see. Okay, so to achieve both marks, or I'd say 1, students need to show their understanding that CSR means, number 1, going above or beyond legal requirements and giving some indication of the context in which those considerations must be, in other words, environmental or social. So the two aspects. So even if for only 1 mark, I would say you need to kind of cover both sides, going above and beyond legal requirements, and then in respect of social or environmental considerations. Most of you know this already. Most of you have used that one in SACs, but just to absolutely nail it and underline it, this is kind of where the definition that we've now been using for the last couple of years, year 11 and 12, this is where this originates from. Okay, this 2019 examiner's report. And like I say, always, if the examiner's report has given us a definition that they say is a solid one, it's worth using it because it's come straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So the next question, I guess, is where has all this CSR stuff originated from? Okay, I've said this in class many times. This wasn't really a thing when I was your age. Nobody was talking about corporate social responsibility. Certainly wasn't as widespread a thing at all. I don't think I'd ever heard that term when I was your age. So where has this kind of all come from over the last so many years? Who is expecting businesses to operate in a socially responsible manner? A number of places. First off, employees, okay? More and more employees are choosing to work for businesses who have strong ethics and strong social responsibility, okay? So in other words, if you want to attract and retain the best staff, it makes sense to demonstrate an ethical position and be demonstrating social responsibility in your operations, because otherwise people may choose to not work for you. Also, CSR impacts positively on the corporate culture. So we've talked about sort of corporate culture earlier on in the course. It's really important to maintain a positive corporate culture where everybody is happy. If everybody's happy, everyone's going to be productive, producing good quality work, and all the other kind of areas that leads to. It also reduces staff turnover, increases productivity, reduces staff absenteeism, and all of that stuff. So basically, the only place that a positive corporate culture leads to is a positive one. And part of what can make up a positive corporate culture is by having strong social responsibility. So employees is an important source of all this kind of pressure on businesses to act in a socially responsible way. Secondly, customers. Okay, these days customers are more likely to buy from a business that demonstrates social responsibility. Pretty straightforward. Or I guess probably more to the point, if a customer is looking at maybe a couple of options of where they might buy whatever it is they're looking to buy, if option A, is a really strong ethical company that demonstrates really good social responsibility, and option B is not, there's more chance these days than ever before that the customer is going to go for option A. So again, just from a business point of view, attracting customers, retaining customers, it's worth demonstrating social responsibility. Thirdly, shareholders or investors, depending on what type of business we're talking about, what type of business structure. These days, again, more and more and more. Again, a lot of this is these days because this didn't used to be the case. But these days, there are investors out there that make their investment choices based on the level of social responsibility that is demonstrated by the business. Okay, so they're only going to invest in businesses that demonstrate an ethical standpoint, demonstrate social responsibility. Another word for this is green investments. Okay, so investing in business. The green kind of insinuates sustainability and all that sort of stuff, but it's kind of broader than that. So green investing is investing in any business that demonstrates a high level of social responsibility. Fourthly, now there's a whole bunch in here. I've kind of thrown them all in together. Society, the community, kind of the same thing, but also the media. Really could maybe have that, the media as a fifth one if you liked. Society and community, look, everybody is becoming increasingly aware of and concerned about social responsibility issues. It's just more out there, people are more aware of it than they were, like I say, a generation or two ago. Maybe because of the proliferation of the media, particularly social media. But the media is, a lot behind this as well. The media, don't forget, love a bad news story. So if a business has demonstrated somehow, a negative social responsibility or corporate irresponsibility, however you want to put it, the media will be all over it like a rash. And then suddenly the business has been reported on kind of in a bad light, not a good look for reputation. Again, can lead to a reduction in sales, customers, and all that kind of stuff, which is not going to help profitability. So lots of different places this pressure is coming on for businesses to act in a social responsible way. So now I guess the next step in that is, what are the benefits to the business of being social responsible? We've looked at where the pressure is coming from, but what are the benefits to a business in actually operating in this way? Okay, number one, builds community goodwill. Okay, just builds goodwill with community. It enhances the business's reputation. Okay, its image. All of that combined makes the business more competitive. The business is more competitive, then that leads to, an increase in sales, an increase in market share, an increase in the ability to meet shareholder expectations. Again, tying this back to those objectives, we've got those key business objectives right at the beginning of the course, just to kind of link things and kind of close the circle. Makes it easier to attract and retain staff. Just talked about that one a little bit before. Again, attracting investors, we talked about that. All of this stuff combined leads to an increase in the chances that the business is going to be more profitable. Okay, so if you think about it that way, it just makes good business sense to be socially responsible. Forget about the ethics behind it even. Even if you don't believe in that, if you act in a socially responsible way these days, it just leads to an increase in business. It just makes good business sense. Okay, so now the main event. Okay, so the key knowledge dot point. This is what the key knowledge dot point said. Okay, considerations in an operation system. We've seen that term before, and already when you see those two words, operation system, you know where your brain needs to go: inputs, processes, and outputs. But in this one, it actually spells it out for you. So the environmental sustainability of inputs, the amount of waste generated from processes, and production of outputs. So there, clearly, within this key knowledge dot point, is referring back to, I think it's 3.3.2, the operation system. So again, this ties back to that earlier key knowledge dot point. And now we're going to look at the operation system that we've already learned about from this sort of socially responsible perspective, and kind of lay some of this ethics and social responsibility over the top of what we already know about the operation system. So all we're going to do now is literally take each of the three elements of the operation system: inputs, processes, outputs, in turn, and I'll just give you a whole kind of a list of examples of different ways in which the business can demonstrate social responsibility to that particular element. Okay, so this will make sense as we go through. And I don't think any of this is rocket science. A lot of this will be obvious to you. I don't think there's anything particularly difficult to understand here, but it's just kind of laying a social responsibility framework across the top of that operation system that you already learned about. So inputs, consideration one. Could the business use more environmentally sustainable inputs? So in other words, if wood is involved, could we use wood from replanted forests? If we use paper in our business, and pretty much every business is going to use paper in its office function, could we use recycled paper? Basically, any inputs that you use, are there options available which are kind of more environmentally sustainable? Not rocket science, pretty straightforward. Consideration two, could we be using more efficient and environmentally friendly equipment? So, for example, if our business runs a fleet of vehicles, could we convert to a fleet of hybrid or even electric options rather than using petrol or diesel? Are there more efficient machines out there? So if we're using machinery, imagine if we're a factory, we're using this big heavy plant and equipment, heavy machinery. Are there more efficient options out there which would use less energy, again, more green and more environmentally friendly, and therefore reducing the carbon footprint? Okay, so again, pretty straightforward, I think. Consideration three, at inputs, could we consider the purchase of local inputs as opposed to those from further afield, particularly overseas? But we could be talking further afield in Australia. Now, if we are talking about potentially buying inputs from overseas for the cost benefits that would lead to, in other words, accessing cheaper inputs from overseas, would it be more socially responsible to support Australian business and Australia's economy, but rather than from buying, from overseas, from buying within Australia? Second aspect to that, what about the carbon footprint involved? If we're buying stuff from overseas, okay, yeah, it might be cheaper to us, running our business, but you're now creating a bigger carbon footprint in importing or shipping over those resources than if you were buying locally. So there's kind of two angles to that one. The idea of supporting Australian jobs, the Australian economy, but also the carbon footprint from buying further afield. Okay, so in terms of where our inputs are coming from. Fourth one, are we or our subcontractors and suppliers practicing the ethical treatment of employees? Now, this one will be particularly relevant if you're dealing with suppliers who are based overseas, particularly in certain countries, or if we're subcontracting part or all of our operation overseas. We actually talk about that. The final key knowledge dot point talks about global considerations, and we talk about that a little bit more. But you can understand that a lot of businesses have overseas suppliers or actually manufacture their goods, provide their services from overseas. If we're doing that, what do we know about the businesses that we're dealing with over there? Are they being socially responsible with regards to the treatment of employees? What do we know about their operation? Something else to consider if we're going to be dealing with overseas business in terms of sourcing our inputs. Consideration 5, could we use greener renewable energy somewhere in our processes? In other words, could we use solar panels, wind energy, wave energy? Not those last two, not quite as prolific yet. Solar, I mean, solar's not exactly prolific, but more so than those other two. You can see the factory, can we chuck solar panels up on our roof to be more environmentally sustainable? Now, there's some examples, okay, but what are the downsides of doing all of those things? Okay, seems like a no-brainer to do those things, but what do we need to think about? Why might we not? And again, think in terms of a discuss question here when we need to look at positives and negatives. Okay, recycled resources are usually more expensive. Electric vehicles right now are very, very expensive. Inputs are often much cheaper if you do source them from overseas, despite the social responsibility element of not supporting Australian jobs or creating a far carbon footprint from bringing them further afield. At the end of the day, they're cheaper. And green technology such as solar can be really, really expensive to install. So basically, summing all of that up, operating with social responsibility is usually the more expensive route to take from a purely dollars point of view. Okay, lots of benefits that we saw of doing it, but at the end of the day, it's going to cost you more money. It's kind of like making an investment. You're investing in this stuff for the long-term returns that we talked about before. Okay, so that's our inputs. Move on to processes. Again, a list of considerations we need to think about. Could we reduce, reuse, or recycle? We saw that strategy in our waste minimization video. Could we some of the resources we use in our production process? Pretty straightforward. Could we use more green renewable energy in our processes? Now, again, think about this one. That if you're answering a question and then asked about, list some considerations to do with the operation system, if you're going to talk about this, because we just kind of talked about that in terms of energy being input, but if you're going to talk about it in terms of it being used in our process, don't use it for both. Okay, that would be double dipping. Okay, so just be careful, because a couple of these do kind of repeat over inputs, because we can talk about the inputs in terms of the inputs into the business, but then how they're used in our processes. So just be careful with double dipping here. So just don't repeat yourself when you're talking about inputs, processes, outputs. So that one, you could talk about it either as an input or how it's used in the process. Don't talk both. Consideration 3, are we practicing waste minimization? Again, the strategies we've talked about before. You can see a lot of this stuff links to earlier parts of this outcome, thereby reducing our impact on the environment. Could we implement just-in-time, lean management? Again, there's a couple of strategies we've talked about from 2 different parts of this outcome, okay, making links back. But if we're doing those things, it's going to minimize the amount of waste, which is being socially responsible. Consideration 4, are we disposing of any waste that we do produce in a safe and responsible manner, particularly if you're producing some kind of hazardous waste? Okay, you can't just chuck this where you want. You need to be disposing particularly of hazardous waste in a very specific way. So make sure you're doing all of that. Consideration 5, are we going above and beyond in our occupational health and safety responsibilities with respect to our employees and other visitors in the business? Again, are we going above and beyond? Okay, being socially responsible is not just meeting OH&S guidelines. If we're being socially responsible, we're kind of taking steps beyond what we legally need to do. Okay, so referring back to that definition of what CSR actually means. Number 6, are we keeping our processes local, i.e. supporting Australian employment, which is deemed to be a CSR? Again, another issue here with the double dipping if we're talking about sourcing our inputs, but now we're talking about actually carrying out our processes. So don't use this argument for both inputs and processes. Use it only once. Are we minimizing the number of dangerous or repetitive tasks undertaken by employees by reducing technology? So when we looked at the introduction of technology strategies, one of the advantages was exactly this, minimizing the number of dangerous or repetitive tasks undertaken by staff. So again, another link back to content we've already talked about. And then finally, we're going to move on to outputs. Okay, this one's a little bit more challenging, a little bit more tricky. I don't know. I don't think it's as obvious. It's not as easy to come up with them off the top of your head. But anyway, here's a few that you can use. Consideration one, producing packaging that minimizes any negative impact on the environment. So another is by using biodegradable packaging. Headline there, Coles to stop selling reusable plastic bags in Australia. So that comes out of May 2023, which is now. Look, the supermarkets they got rid of the completely reusable, the really thin bags a couple of years ago, and they started selling these. I think they're pretty standard in about 15 cents, the thicker bags, the reusable 15-cent bags. But now that's deemed to be not sustainable, environmentally sustainable. So now they're going to get rid of those. So Coles have announced it. I'm pretty sure Woolies will soon follow suit. So then I'm assuming the only types of bags they're going to be selling at the supermarkets is those cloth, the green cloth bags, or I don't know what colour Coles are, red maybe. But yeah, so moving away from plastic entirely. Okay. So any business somehow produce packaging that minimises any negative impact on the environment. The other example I've got there is McDonald's. This is way before your time, but in the late 90s, the packaging that you see there, it's this polystyrene, polyfoam kind of packaging. That's how all the burgers came. I think still some local takeaways use that kind of packaging. But the reason it's used is because it retains heat much better than the paper or cardboard packaging that we now see McDonald's use. So it did have its reason and its purpose, but in the late 90s, they realised that the amount of this stuff that was ended up in landfill, and obviously it doesn't biodegrade, was not a good look. So they got rid of all that and then went to the kind of cardboard paper packaging that you see today. And then, of course, more recently, the straws, okay? McDonald's and pretty much everybody else has gone away from plastic straws to the now paper ones. And let's be honest, the paper straws are pretty useless. You leave one of those in a milkshake for a few minutes and it's just soggy. No use, but at least it's socially responsible. Consideration two, in terms of outputs, could we be developing products that are environmentally friendly? So I think the car industry moving from petrol and diesel options now, moving more towards the hybrid or completely electric, and that shift will be complete, I would imagine, within 10, 15, 20 years. Probably won't be able to buy petrol or diesel vehicles at some point in the not too distant future. Or if we're not creating products which are more environmentally friendly, could we at least create products with recyclable elements at the end of their life? So in other words, once the life cycle of the product's finished, when it's thrown away, as much of it as possible could be recycled as opposed to ending up in landfill. Third one, could we offer customers incentives for returning the products that can be recycled properly? They are Nespresso pods, so they kind of have a recycling scheme where you can recycle them the right way. So these things, they're aluminium, I think. So rather than them ending up in landfill, there is a way that you can actually recycle these things properly so they end up getting recycled as opposed to ended up in landfill. So that's one example of that. Fourth, final one I'm going to give you, does our labeling on our products provide clear instructions for consumers about the safe and appropriate methods for disposal of, I guess, the packaging and the product itself once you'd finished with it? Okay. Again, you don't necessarily legally have to do that, but you're demonstrating social responsibility if you've got some elements of that on your packaging. So it shows customers, how to get rid of either the product and or the packaging in a socially responsible way. Okay, so that is CSR and operations. So we've looked at, a good definition of CSR and where that comes from and why we used it. We've looked at where the pressure is coming from for businesses to act in this socially responsible way. Looked at some of the benefits to a business of acting in this way. And then we broke down the operation system, inputs, processes, outputs, and gave you some examples of exactly how businesses might demonstrate social responsibility with respect to each of those elements of the operation system. Now, again, there was, 5 or 6, 7, I think, for processes, a whole bunch of different ones. You need to think, if you're using these in a case study, which ones would be appropriate or relevant to that case study, because not all of those considerations we went through are going to apply to every business. That's kind of like a generic, possibility list. but which you can use if it's just, referring to a business. But if you're given a case study, you need to think a bit carefully about which of those might be appropriate and relevant to be using in that particular scenario. But anyway, that's it for CSR operations. I will see you in the next video, which is the last one for outcome 3, last one for operations management. In fact, the last one for unit 3. I'll see you then. Cheers for now.